Ominous. Yeah. Prashant has a bachelor's and master's in IT from India, and 14 years of Canadian IT experience in various industry verticals. He works as a senior cybersecurity advisor for a Fortune 500, and he calls himself a geek with a purpose and likes to support the budding talent, share his experience, and continue to progress the cybersecurity discipline. He considers himself a problem solver to solve interesting IT problems, not just cybersecurity. He likes to play chess, hike and camp in the mountains alone, and ponder over the purpose of life and nature. With his talk, I've got the wrong name here, so countering cyber sabotage, consequence-driven, cyber-informed engineering methodology. I'd like to introduce and welcome to the B-side stage, Prashant.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? You can't? Okay. Can you hear me now? All right. So this is my take of problem solving. I was seeing since yesterday, the speakers were kind of talking from the podium there. So I tried to be a little bit more, fluid and try to walk around. So I went around and made a quick lanyard and put a small stripe and said, I got to talk and just move around here. So thank you, everybody. Welcome to this 2022 B-Sides Edmonton conference. My name is Prashant. Thanks, Thomas, for a quick introduction of myself. My talk's presentation title was actually Oracle ERP implementation in Enbridge, but there was some hiccups in the presentation material last minute. So this is another talk which I gave in B-Sides Calgary last month. And I thought it'll be a pretty interesting revise to do it this year in B-Sides Edmonton as well. This talk on countering cyber sabotage, consequence-driven cyber-enabled engineering is actually a fruit of labor which I worked with Andrew Bachman, you see there. He is a grid strategist in Idaho National Labs in US. And we had a 2 months of stint together, and he has a book which he has written called Countering Cyber Sabotage. So I'll come to that in subsequent slides. And I thought it's a pretty interesting topic one should talk about. There was a study we did in Enbridge on this topic, but this motivated me to come back and share this concept with you all. So this will talk about a little bit on critical infrastructure. How many of you know what critical infrastructure is? Okay, industrial control systems, SCADA, right? If folks who are new here or students, you don't know, ping me on the side and I'll kind of try my best to tell you what critical infrastructure is. So the talk is about cyber sabotage, and it's about engineering mindset. How you bring an engineering mindset to try to solve problems which cybersecurity can bring. If you're not able to hear me in the back, I can request you to come to the forward. If at all, if you feel like you can come and sit down. If my voice is good, then all good, all right? I got some models here. I hope I'll have some time to share with you some models on what this topic is about. But let's go from there. So some of my coordinates, I have a Twitter coordinate, which I very seldom use. I don't know if I'm going to use it anymore. I have some strong beliefs about that right now, based on what's happening in Twitter. But I have a LinkedIn profile, and connect me if you want at the end of the talk. So my views, these are purely my views. They're not of my employers. A quick disclaimer, it's just a research, more of understanding this concept, which I'm sharing with you all. Critical infrastructure exploited. What are we missing, right? Folks who know about critical infrastructure, I work for Enbridge, it's a pipeline company, but there are critical infrastructure across nations, right? When we talk about in Canada, Public Safety Canada, they bring around probably 10 to 12 critical infrastructures, if I'm not mistaken. Health, water, energy, nuclear, power, oil and gas, electricity, right? So what are we missing when this infrastructure is being attacked? We live in an oil and gas hub here in Edmonton. Alberta is an oil and gas province. You may have heard news of systems being attacked, critical infrastructure being compromised. What are we missing? So this talk is about looking at the consequence side first, which I'll come to, and then going back onto the cyber side of things, which may impact getting into those consequences. Because, the world is keep on going. We all know security is not 100%. You will always find flaws and things will keep on going. So there are issues which we can try to fundamentally look at from a different angle, and that's what this talk is about. So, this pretty much talks about the Triconix sys malware. This was a malware which hit Saudi Aramco. If you can Google it, if you don't know about it, it hit their safety instrumented systems, as they call it in industrial control systems. You go after the safety systems, you decommission them, or you take them out, and you are basically leading to, if you've heard of Stuxnet, right? The Iran centrifuges, they went so fast, and they went out of commission. So safety systems, foreign governments tampering with U.S. Supply chain attacks. So we'll talk about those. Cyber sabotage or cyber twist. So this is a book, Cyber Sabotage by Andrew Bachman, Sarah Freeman from Idaho National Labs. I'll encourage many of you, if you can take a copy of it. I got a copy and I read through it. A very interesting concept. The 5 Ds of cyber sabotage. I'm not talking about cyber threat. I'm not talking about cyber adversary. I'm talking about sabotage, right? You go so deep into the network that you try to bring down an organization's critical infrastructure you're talking about. Disrupt, deny, degrade, destroy, or deceive. Take those words. Andrew Bachman, in one of his YouTube videos, talked about a CEO of a big energy company in US, and he went to Congress, and he got quite intrigued by this idea which Andrew was putting forth in this concept, and he said to Congress in a hearing, and he said, as a CEO of a big energy company in America, I can sustain disruption, maybe denying my services, degradation, but I cannot sustain destruction of my equipment. Think it for a second. When you have these old legacy industrial control systems or systems which have been instrumented or designed for the past 20 to 30 years, you can't just rip and replace them. They're giving you a critical, energy supply in the province or in the country. So it comes to a point where you can actually destroy this equipment through cyber means, right? Stuxnet of the world, Sandworm, which was one of the books which Robert Martin said we should read yesterday. I actually read through that book. Very interesting read. So I'll encourage many of you to read through that too. So destruction of equipment is possible through cyber means. Can we sustain that? Possibly not. So this talk is about understanding what are some of those critical functions in a nation which we cannot live without. They should not fail. What can we do to sustain that they do not fail? So that's what these 5 Ds of cyber sabotage is. So risk assessment or risk management, we are all in cybersecurity, or at least budding cybersecurity folks. Information risk management is our bread and butter, right? I'm standing on a floor here. I know that this is my basis that I'm standing on. This is my support. So when we do risk management in an organization or in the industry, we do, risk from left to right, subjective, quantitative, qualitative, all those 9 yards. What again, cyber sabotage or consequence-driven cyber-enabled engineering speaks to is the risk at the national security level. When you talk about risk at a national security level, you cannot, as I said, take on that the functions cannot fail. Let's take an example, right? We are in Alberta, and if you go to -30, -35, you have power running in your industry, in your homes. I don't know how many of you have backup generators or inverters. I don't, right? So if your power goes down for a sustained period of time, and that's possible, if people can go after the grid of Alberta, because I used to work with Capital Power. We know how the grid works in province or across the country. It will be hard to sustain unless you have those backups which can help you go through that. So imagine those scenarios where natural gas goes out. You cannot heat your home, right? Power goes out. You cannot heat your home or even make food or whatnot, right? This is some basic technology, basic utilities we need to look at, and we cannot fail. So what can we do? How can we architect those that we cannot fail? And so this talk is trying to understand what consequences can happen on that particular function. Again, I know there's a methodology, what they call the CCE methodology. This talk is more about giving you or whetting your appetite to make you understand how critical we are living through this, through the world, and what we should do. So again, I'm not talking of basic risk management. I'm talking of risk management at a national security level, where you have this critical infrastructure and how you have to sustain and operate it. Cyber defenders spend big time and money calculating likelihood of compromise, right? How many of you know what a risk equation is? I mean, risk equals vulnerability into the threat actor, into the probability of a vulnerability to be exploited, multiplied by the consequence or impact to an organization. A very standard risk equation, right? And you put in numbers there, you put in subjective, qualitative information, that's your call. That probability of exploitation of a vulnerability in the context of national security or critical infrastructure is assumed to be 1. Michael Hayden, the former director of CIA, there are only two kind of companies in this world, those who know that they have been hacked and those who don't know that they have been hacked. I mean, at some point in time, you will be compromised. Get over it. Get over that feeling that you can always prevent cyber threats across the industry. You got to come back to the defender side, understand the response side. The previous talk is all about how you do threat hunting, threat response, incident response. Many of the talks in this conference is around that. So that mind shift of moving from preventative into the defensive aspect is important. Assume at a national security level, the attackers would have exactly the same knowledge as you do, and they will go after your infrastructure and they will attack it. And they can compromise it. Are we ready to sustain operations even in the middle of being attacked? In the concept we call cyber resiliency. But so keep that in mind, right? You will be attacked at some point. Get over it. So how do we prepare in that event? Critical functions. So what you see on the screen here is, manufacturing, natural gas or oil and gas, power, nuclear, as those icons there, and enabling functions which provide and support those critical functions. I thought, what should I make as a model out of it? So I asked my boy, I said, can I take your small toy car? And it's a police car, by the way. Just to give you an idea of what's a process control or what's a system which is important for you, right? So this is a car, and it's a police car, 911 call. They have to go, they have to respond. That the critical function which is being provided by the police services is from point A to point B, they have to respond to a 911 call. What's the enabling function to this? They have mechanics inside, they have engine, they have tires, they have exhaust system, they definitely have these lights which are quite important so that they get a freeway through the road. They have monitors through which they can figure out what's happening. So the enabling functions provide you a critical function which is to go from point A to point B and respond to an incident. So in a similar fashion, in critical infrastructure, when we do oil and gas through a pipeline or we generate power through a power plant, you have critical enabling functions which support that, right? What are those? Infrastructure, people, process, and technology. What is infrastructure? Brick and mortar. You are in this big building. We are talking, I'm talking here. There's lights out here. So, I'm talking, this is a critical function being provided, and then we are being supported around it, right? So it's important, and these adversaries, they go after those enabling functions. They will go after trying to sabotage this police car if somebody is really bad, so that they cannot respond from point A to point B. So those enabling functions, infrastructure, people, process, and technology. Keep that in mind. Many a times we talk about, going after technology, the IT side of things, which is what cyber, we talk about cybersecurity. But there's a people aspect. I can take a person, give him a bribe, and make him an insider threat to my organization. There's nothing fancy about it. I can go after the process if I know what the technology is. I'll come to that. People can copy process. If I were to stand up an organization similar to mine, and I don't have enough time, I can go after their process maps. I'll use that, rinse and repeat, and stand my company and be their competitor in no time. And that has, nothing much to do with probably on the technology side, more how they run their process. An HR company has a process from recruiting right up to, soliciting candidates to recruiting them. So, you can hack the processes too. So that's the idea, how you go after the enabling functions which provide you the critical function. What you see on the screen here is a natural gas compressor station. As I said, I work in oil and gas. when we deliver gas from point A to point B, this is one of the sites which is actually fenced, and one of the functions of a compressor station, it's actually as part of the pipeline, just sharing with you, from point A to point B, when we gather gas and we deliver it out to power plants or to customers. These are compressor stations which compress gas so that it flows forward. Unlike liquids, gas actually expands, as you know, physics 101, right? So you got to compress it every time it moves, it expands. You compress it every time it moves. So a compressor station in a natural gas pipeline is the workhorse of the system. What's the critical function that pipeline is providing? Delivery of natural gas from point A, gathering sites, to point B, which is our homes, or even power plants, which are natural gas-fired power plants. The enabling function is a compressor station which compresses, sends it forward, compresses, sends it forward, compresses, sends it forward. What if an adversary goes after that compressor station and the IT infrastructure of that compressor station? And if that's a single point of failure in your system, they have basically got their objective, and you cannot deliver gas anymore because your compressor station is out of commission. They went after the 5 Ds: disrupt, destroy, deny, deceive, and the other one I talked about, destruct. An adversary exploits our enabling functions and impacts our critical functions, right? So I talked about how they go after the legs of the stool so the stool cannot stand. Exploiting how we deliver our critical functions, that's the important aspect. And you got to know what your single point of failures are, and where they are, you go after those and you impact those. An example of that, so PHMSA is a regulatory organization in USA, again in the natural gas pipeline industry. They have a running log of incidents which have happened in the industry. This is one example. It's public knowledge. Anybody can Google and find out. Seneca Compressor Station in West Virginia. This is, again, one of the compressor stations in April 2009. A power went out of that compressor station. And the power went out, basically, the compressor station could not compress. The pressure went down of the natural gas. They had to shut down the compressor station, and they had to, it affected the delivery of natural gas in the pipeline. What it is trying to say is simply this, that there is a regulator which talks about these kind of incidents in USA, but the fact that power, infrastructure, people, process, these things affect your critical functions, and these are logged, and they actually go after investigation on these types of incidents. So that's an idea, to give you where we should focus our attention as cyber defenders, and I'll come to that in my subsequent slides here. So vehicles of cyber sabotage, right? Cyber threat actors have an extensive collection of tools, methods, and resources to launch cyber attacks against enterprises. I'll come to this concept a little bit further in another slide here, this one. The adversary, example of likelihood of the breach equals 1. When I was giving you an example on the second slide of Michael Hayden saying, you will be breached, get over it, this is exactly what it is. Assume at a national security level, critical infrastructure, you will be breached. So likelihood is 1. Now with that understanding, how my risk equation changes. My adversary would have a logical and physical access to the victim's environment. Assume that he's inside the environment, has the same set of information, administrative access, which a normal administrative person would have or do. They call it living of the land techniques, and I'll come to that if folks who are in cybersecurity would know what living of the land techniques are. Is knowledgeable, is well-resourced and capable. So what do I mean by knowledgeable? I had another example for that. So I brought this operator's handbook. By the way, it's a cybersecurity handbook, so you can ping me after the presentation. You can actually buy it. It has a lot of beautiful red team, purple teaming commands you can go after. The idea, what I'm trying to explain here is there's a manual of red teaming, purple teaming, blue teaming commands on Kali Linux, Azure, AWS, whatnot. The full 9 yards from GitHub and whatnot. A bad guy can also have a hand on this. I mean, what stops him from having it? Like a manual of a technology. If I work for a company and I know how the compressor station is working, or if I know how a power grid is working, it's easy to find. There's nothing wrong about it. If I have access to those manuals and of how technology works, The bad guys will have exactly the same information. They can even mimic that in their own lab environments. We are talking about nation states here, right? They have enough money, power, and focus to mimic that in their own environments. So they will have the same technological information which we do with us. Then what's the difference? And I'll come to that. What's the difference and where defenders play a role to disrupt the attacker's attacker chain? So keep that in mind. As I said, we are assuming we are being breached. We are assuming the adversary knows equal or more about our technology. Like in a power station, if they're doing a GE turbine or a natural compressor station or even power station, GE turbines or Siemens Electric utility tools are used. I mean, it's easy to get hand on those manuals. It's not hard, and you can go all 9 yards to understand what that technology is. So where is the difference? Okay, I'll come to that. So this is, adversary is not limited to just network-based cyber attacks. So keep that in mind and expand your horizon. What all can an adversary do? On the physical side, on the cyber side, on the network side, on supply chain or third-party risk management side. So expand your horizon. If I am in this building, how I can be attacked? Somebody can send a bullet from this window. Somebody can throw, something from the top. Somebody can just come and slap me, right? Like you got to figure out and expand your horizon how you can be attacked. So these are some examples. It's not just about sitting on a Kali Linux box and attacking your network infrastructure, going into corporate environment and then going towards your SCADA systems. It's about a third party sending in a USB stick. It's about a contractor who comes in and he brings his own laptop, which is no antivirus on top. And this is literally they're walking in your environment, in your control system and plugging in and going there. Third party risk, contractor risk, product vendors. How many times we have heard about supply chain risks, right? The SolarWinds attack. I don't know how many of you know what SolarWinds Sunburst backdoor was. I talk about it in a subsequent slide too. It shows you fundamentally where are those attack lines. It's not all about top-down defense in depth from internet down to the network, right? It's about those parallel attack lines where people can go after you. And it's people, infrastructure, process, technology. So physical attacks, we can go all 9 yards. There are different types of attacks which can happen on your critical infrastructure. Misuse of technology is an interesting one. I talked about living of the land techniques, right? Misuse of technology will impact your critical functions. Often, adversaries can manipulate existing systems and processes without creating new payloads or malware to carry out an attack. What I'm talking here is living of the land. I mean, simple, you have this, the control systems we have, they have some boundaries. They have some tolerance level. If you have an admin access, you don't need a malware for that. I can increase the tolerance level beyond a certain point, and that will either increase the chlorine in the water treatment plant, or it will increase the revolution in the Stuxnet case in Iran, and the centrifuges went out. And it's not about a malware. It's about you having access to the system, and you're basically misusing the thresholds of what the system provides. Forcing a firmware update, stop charging batteries, open breakers, delete backups. You go into maintenance mode. It's a capability of the system, which leads you to a firmware upgrade. Battery change scheduler. It's a capability of the system. If you have access, you can go after that and change those settings, which can lead to the system, going beyond its threshold. Especially in industrial control systems, when we have these legacy systems, it's hard to manage that. I mean, imagine in that natural gas pipeline, if I increase the pressure on the pipeline more than what the pipeline can sustain, it will burst. And you can do that with standard SCADA controls. You don't need a malware to connect to a SCADA control and do that, as long as you have access to it. So that's an example of living of the land or misuse of technology. Examples of misuse of technology, the Ukraine 2015-2016 crisis. The Ukrenegro, it's Ukraine's power company. They are still called Ukrenegro, as we are in the Russian-Ukraine conflict right now, and Russia is bombarding them with missiles, and the whole critical infrastructure and power is being taken down as winter is coming. So Winston Churchill once said, if you have not learned from history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? So if you have not learned from the 2015-2016 Ukraine crisis, where they were hit by Russian cyber adversaries. And if you read the book Sandworm, you will realize how they went after it. There's actually a YouTube video where this technician sitting here with an HMI on the screen, it's a human-machine interface, which actually runs your power stations, and he looks at the mouse going back and forth, and he calls his service desk and said, are you guys connecting to my system and doing something? They said, no. It's literally a Russian adversary with an access to their HMI opening breakers on the power system. And when you're opening breakers into an open relay mode, you know, there's a surge of power which basically broke down the transformers across the grid. And so it's misuse of technology in a very, very fundamental fashion, which Russia did, and they're still doing. When the Russian crisis started in this February of this year, they went after these techniques because they had access to the systems. Again, you know, there's a back and forth happening in the conflict right now, but that's there. And then the Florida Oldsmar incident. I mean, Google that if you have not. It's a water treatment plant with a human-machine interface exposed to the internet. Can you imagine? Like a system which runs your water treatment plants is exposed to the internet right off the bat. RDP access, remote desktop. The bad guy comes in and he literally has access to the HMI, and now he can turn on and off or increase the chlorine levels or fluoride level, whatever the chemical they use in the system, which is not going out into the county. That's living of the land. Misuse of technology to lead to an impact to the society. Unverified trust, as I was talking, right? Different ways you can come into the environment. So example, who has access to what? Who accesses data from where? Software updates, employee background checks. Do we do that? You know, it's the people side of things. Supply chain, third-party risk. You know, what kind of vendors we are bringing in? Do those vendors, are they vetted out properly? Do we have contractors who we know what kind of laptop they're bringing in, or the USB sticks they're just plugging in and saying we are doing a firmware upgrade, right? Maintenance of and support of vendors, access of compliance checks, subcontracted operators. So it's all about unverified trust, and it comes from the people side, as I said, process, technology side, and the infrastructure side. And it's, you know, there's a whole 9 yards around what's called zero trust, as Robert was saying yesterday, Robert Martin in a call in his presentation. But, you know, how do you verify trust? So trust, but verify. The concept of, you know, you can trust people, but you got to make sure that they are the right people who have access to your systems. Okay? So I've talked about this, the SolarWinds supply chain attack. Why was it so fundamental? I mean, folks who have probably read through this, right? Why was it such a big news in the industry? Sunburst Mac backdoor, SolarWinds is pretty much used almost everywhere. So the adversaries are not going after the downstream companies. They're going after the vendors who support those downstream companies across the board. So, you know, talk about SolarWinds, talk about Cisco, talk about any technology. Not that I'm calling them out, but if that technology is so pervasive, you go after the technology, right? And then if you find loopholes or backdoors, then that technology would lead to a larger impact across the organizations. I mean, U.S. federal government was so worried about this attack, and Russia actually put in the backdoor of the Sunburst malware in the SolarWinds system. So. You know, that's the kind of nature of systems you're seeing which can be impacted at the enabling function level. So what is the solution? You know, for now, I'll be talking about the problem. We have these critical functions, enabling functions, how they can be impacted. What is the solution? What am I trying to propose? What Andrew Bachman wants to say in his book. Defender's advantage. Let's read through it. The adversary will always know at least as much as you do about your technology. Maybe even more. But they won't always know how you use your technology to deliver a critical function. So I have my laptop, I use it differently than you use your laptop. I can have an IBM ThinkPad, you can have an IBM ThinkPad. So we have the same technology, but our views is different. And that's where I have a domain knowledge how I make use of my technology. So companies who use these systems, GE, Aviva, Siemens, whatnot, in their critical infrastructure, they know their own process. I know where are my single points of failure, where I know I don't have my single points of failure, how I use my technology to deliver natural gas or liquids or power or any other utility or water. And that's what adversaries don't know unless they actually hack your process and try to mimic who you are. But that's probably more harder than knowing about the technology, right? So that's what's called defender's advantage. A defender would know more about how they function than the adversary. Perfect knowledge, the understanding of how a critical function is uniquely implemented at an organization. So that's something we as an organization know and will make use of when we defend. So I'll come to that. The answer is consequence-driven, cyber-informed engineering. We're looking at consequences. We're looking at cyber reasons which can lead to those consequences. Again, if you recall, Robert Martin in his keynote yesterday said, what is the consequences which the risk leaders need to know? It's not all about technology. We have enough technology out there in our organizations. It's about optimizing them. It's not all about controls. It's about understanding what consequences are there, and you go back and see, are my controls effective? You know, what are the reasons why my consequences can be impacted or can be realized? So methodology of using guiding organizations, identifying and mitigating catastrophic effects resulting from cyber-enabled sabotage. 4 phases. These are the 4 phases of CCE. They are consequence prioritization, system of system analysis, consequence-based targeting, and mitigations and protections. So what they are, in a nutshell, is this. So consequence prioritization means you look at high consequence events which can happen in your critical function. So if I'm, again, delivering oil or gas, or if I'm delivering power, what high consequence event might happen? One example, in the middle of winter, -35, my power can go down for 1 week. That's the scenario. It could be a very realistic scenario if the grid goes down. What are the consequence events which can lead to that? Maybe a critical mass of my power plants in the province go down and they cannot sustain power in the grid. And hence my grid cannot sustain and it will collapse. So those are high consequence events you got to know. And that's where you need to bring your team, your stakeholders, understand what those consequences are and jot them down. And you know, you could have 4 or 5 or 6 of those consequences. You see what I'm trying to say? The risk equation, we are not looking at the threat actor here or the vulnerability. We are looking at the consequence aspect first, and then coming back into what the threat actors would be, what the vulnerability would be, and how the risk can be mitigated. System of system analysis means how a cyber threat adversary can get access to my systems to realize that consequence. So if I have access to a human machine interface which is running a power operations or a pipeline operations, how can an adversary get access to that? They can go after my corporate network, they can go after my multi-factor authentication, they can get an employee and give him some money to be an insider threat for themselves, they can put a USB stick, they can go after a contractor who can do a firmware upgrade and then compromise that HMI. What are the access methods to which an adversary can get access to your system, which can lead to the consequence we discussed in phase 1. Phase 3, consequence-based targeting. This is where we see what threat adversaries are even out there who could even accomplish this. You know, advanced persistent threats. We talk about APTs. In the calls yesterday by Jason Maynard and Adam McMath, they talked about the MITRE attack framework, right? And in the MITRE attack framework, you had threat actors, APT 23, APT 19. They have standard tactics, techniques, and procedures. And you know what those are. So you know your consequences. You know how those consequences can be affected. Now you need to find out what threat actors can actually impact and do that. And they're quite well documented to the extent they have been done by threat intel community. This is where intelligence plays a role. Public safety, Canada, you know, US Department of Homeland Security, CIA, they will have intelligence on your adversaries, Russia, China, Iran. They will know what their tactics are through which they can come in. Sunburst or SolarWinds platform, right? They knew that they'll go after the third-party vendor who are supporting you. So they know that intelligence. So you got to know your adversary. That's 3. And the 4th one is mitigation and protections. So it's mitigation. Now you know the whole gamut, right? You know the consequence. You know how it can be impacted. You know who can impact it. What can I do to disrupt that adversary from doing that? This is where the engineering concept comes into play. I don't know how many of you are engineers in this audience here, but engineering plays a very important role. Physics always trumps computer science, and I'll come to that. Physics always trumps electrons. It's how your controls can help you mitigate a problem. Again, what I talk to you is in a different ways spread out in this slide. I'll come to this man in a trusted loop concept before a little quickly later, but I want to show you, this is another example of a tank terminal, right? Many of you drive through Anthony Handy if you're living in Edmonton or in somewhere. What's a tank terminal? Oil. Oil goes up here and it keeps getting filled by pipelines and it fills up and then it goes down and keeps going downstream. I'm just giving an example of an engineering control which can mitigate a problem. So a cyber threat adversary, if they're going after an oil and gas company who has a tank terminal storing oil, and that oil fills up and they put in some kind of a technique, if you will, and that oil spills over. Oil can always spill over if you can turn on the taps and say, you know, don't send it downstream, just keep filling the tank. So oil can spill over. So from an adversary perspective, I have affected a critical function of a tank's storage capacity, right? It's going to spill over, and it can impact what? What kind of environmental impact is a big one? Spilling of oil, you know, everybody will be after you. You know, there's an environmental impact. So that's the critical function being exploited. But what engineering control can I bring around it? So I can put a fence around it, and I can put a ditch where I can take that oil and I can reprocess it or take it out. That's an engineering control to a cyber problem. Through a cyber means somebody spills my oil by impacting the SCADA system. Through an engineering control, I contain that impact by putting in fences, putting in a ditch, taking that oil, and then basically reprocessing it or taking it out of the environment. So think in those terms. Engineering controls help mitigate a cyber problem at a fundamental level. So what is this slide about? Colonel Stanislav Petrov. He's the man who has been tagged to have saved the world in 1983. Go Google it. He was a Russian colonel in the defense, in the intercontinental ballistic missile unit. He was the person who built, with the team, they built an alert system which said in the height of Cold War that when US sends all these missiles over to us, we'll get alerted and we'll respond back. 5 to 6 alerts came in the span of 20 minutes on his system. And he had to make a call whether they were real or false positives. If you only rely on automation and control or computers, and he would have looked at that, he would have escalated it to his command, and they were depending on him as a key decision maker because he was the officer on duty then to respond back. Now imagine 5 nuclear ICBMs sent through US as a false alarm. It actually was false alarm later on, but at that point, you don't have time to think. It's a high consequence event. And as a man in the loop, I'll tell you why this was important. If you purely based on automation controls, you could have responded back with nuclear missiles and, you know, all hell would have broken loose at that time. But what he did, he went back and thought, no, my boss and our doctrine of saving of Russia and how US would respond in the height of a Cold War is they're not going to send 5 nuclear warheads over us. If they really want to obliterate us, they will do mass casualty and send multiple nuclear warheads towards us. So that is one false, one negative. Then he went out and just didn't depend on his alert system. He went out and asked the radio communicators. He asked the Army. He asked the Air Force. Does your command centers, ask the navies, do you find that happening? And they said, no, we find no such incident happening or no such alert on our systems. So that is one way he figured out, oh, that is another way I should take a second look at it. And then the third was, basically, it's the human touch. You got to be very careful responding to such a high consequence event. and he didn't. He knew in 20 minutes, if he would not have responded, the whole Russia would have been obliterated, but it did not happen. On the 21st minute, he took a sigh of relief, and then they figured out at the end of the day when the incident investigation happened, the clouds were at a certain angle, that sun was reflecting on those and was sending they sent five bleeps of light towards the alarm system. So the bottom line here is, you should always have man in a trusted control loop. Imagine, if you are in an environment where your fridges are smart and your thermometers are smart now, and your fridge closes and says there are no eggs, I can't serve you. You say, no, there's another food I can have, but I can't. No, it's locked because it's its own control system. No. So as a human being, you should always have that last emergency option to bypass that control and take over. So think about from an automation perspective. The whole idea is engineering mindset, keep man in the control loop or a manual control always there, so that we have a safeguard out of the environment. Some examples of engineering mitigations in critical infrastructure. I won't bore you with that. It's a valve, it's a relay on the power side, there's a relief valve here. But what I'd like you to kind of ponder over this. Marty Edwards is one of the guys who contributed to that book. He says, act like an engineer, but there's a term there. Think like an adversary, but act like an engineer. So think how you can impact the critical infrastructure, but then act like an engineer. What engineering controls can you bring in? I'm not talking cyber controls here. I'm going back again. This is an engineering methodology. Sometimes engineering mindset helps. What engineering controls can I bring in which can reduce and contain my cyber impact? So that was something I thought is important. Engineering is built on the immutable laws of physics, and it's hard to bypass that. So key concepts, we talked about CCE, we talked about critical functions, unverified trust, and the fact that we look at consequences, then we go after the cyber means, and then we figure out how we're going to do mitigations around that. This was my last presentation or last slide. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Open to question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Prashant. We do have time for questions, if there's any questions. No questions? It's always like an awkward kind of silence when I ask for questions, so we won't belabor that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Thomas.
We'll get ready with the next presentation. Feel free, we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll get going in 10 minutes, so feel free to